Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's 12 o'clock officially, so we're going to get started with our today's presentation on COVID-19 disruption in education. My name is Chris Walsh, and I am pleased to have the honor to moderate this discussion today with Lisa and Esther, who we'll bring on here in a second. But I wanted to thank everybody who is joining us from all over the country, educators, business leaders, organizational leaders. We're excited to have you here, and thank you again for taking time out of your busy days. I know that we're all stuck at home, or many of us are still stuck at home, but you still have a lot going on, and maybe even more so these days. And we know a lot of that time is spent in digital forums and Zoom calls and things like this. And we certainly do not take your attention for granted. So we appreciate you taking time out to be a part of this important conversation. So thank you again for being here. A little bit about this event. Today, as you know, we have an exciting discussion with Esther Wojcicki, Lisa K. Solomon, to talk about everything related to what this current health crisis means for education. And we have a wide range of subjects that we're going to talk about. But this whole experience, this virtual event, is brought to you by a new organization that we want to make sure you know about. This is being produced by Gratus Labs. Gratus Labs is a new, exciting organization with a very important mission to accelerate human potential by bringing experts and innovators from all around the world to other folks to learn together, to start conversations together, and to start to tackle many of the challenges that we face in our local communities and the world. And so thank you to Gratus Labs for producing this and sponsoring and bringing us all together. So with all of that, we've got more and more people joining us, which is great. Let's bring in Esther and Lisa and say hello to them. Hello, Lisa.
Hello.
Hello, Esther.
Hello.
Good to see you
How are
guys.
you? Yes.
Hopefully you're staying
Very,
cool here in the Bay Area. It's a hot one today.
yes. It's very nice to be inside.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Uh,
So I wanted to bring you in so everybody can see your faces, but I want to give folks a little bit of heads up of how this is going to work. So what we are planning to do is that for the first half of this conversation is to have a panel conversation with Lisa and Esther and me chiming in from time to time. And we might even have a special guest for you at some point in the conversation. And then what we will do at about halfway through, a little after 12:30 or so, we will turn it over to audience questions. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A section here on Zoom. So not in the chat. The chat is actually more for if you have a question for the moderators or a question about this event or a technical issue, you can put that in the chat. Only the panelists and the moderators will see that. But if you have a question that you want to ask Lisa or Esther or myself or our surprise guest even, then please put that in Q&A at any point. You can even upvote other people's questions. So if somebody puts something in that you agree with, you can click upvote, and then we will tackle all of those towards the second half of this conversation. So we're going to dive right in and start with just some brief intros. If you guys don't already know Lisa and Esther, well then I don't know where you've been hiding, because they are fabulous education innovators and leaders here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm also at. And Lisa is an educator at the Stanford D School, best-selling author and leader in design thinking, especially for how it's being used in education and business. And she's also the force behind a number of innovative projects in civics education, a self-proclaimed doer, which we love, of course. So thank you, Lisa, for being here.
Thanks. Great to be here.
And Esther, many of you might know, is a celebrated journalism teacher of 38 years, who is just finally maybe retiring from Palo Alto Unified. Is that really happening, Esther?
yes, it's really happening tomorrow.
Oh, wow. So is this officially your last day as a teacher?
Tomorrow is officially my last day as a teacher. That's a
Wow.
really big deal.
That is a big deal, a big deal. Well, for those of you who don't know of Esther's work, she leads probably the largest journalism program, high school journalism program in the country at Palo Alto High School. But on top of that, she is also a nonprofit leader, an entrepreneur in her own right, and now a best-selling author as well. So we're excited to have you here for this conversation, Esther. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for including me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And for those of you who haven't met me, my name's Chris Walsh. I'm a longtime educator. I'm an ed tech entrepreneur, and I'm currently the director of a new Center for Innovation at Crondelet High School in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm again pleased to moderate this question between Lisa and Esther and see where this all goes. So where we wanted to start actually is with a poll. We want to get your thoughts on where you're at today, especially around this crisis that we're in today with COVID-19. And so we're going to put up a poll here for you all to react to. It's anonymous, so please feel that we're not tracking any of your answers here, and we won't report them out to anybody. But we do want to hear kind of your honest opinion about what you think are some of the current challenges in education around COVID-19. So if we can put that poll up real quick, that would be great, and you'll have a few minutes to answer it. There we go. So what is the biggest challenge that educators face with COVID-19 crisis? And you can see I've got a number of things to choose from here: keeping students and faculty safe, maintaining high quality instruction, substantial funding cuts. We know that those are already coming, ensuring equity for all students, being adaptive and responsive to changing circumstances. So if you could take a few seconds here to answer this poll, just the question number one. I think that there are a couple polls coming, but just for poll number one, we've got a couple people who have already started to answer. This was great. And again, we know that there probably are other challenges besides this one, but these are the ones that are sort of top of mind, and we want to hear your honest thoughts on your experience, whether you are an education leader, whether you are a parent, whether you are a business leader, nonprofit leader. Everybody has a very valid experience and opinion here that we really want to hear. And so we've got about 50% of you have voted, which is great. And again, I think it's showing two polls right now accidentally. Just focus on the top poll. That's the one that we want to do right now. We'll bring that second poll back up a little bit later. We'll give you about another 10 seconds or so here to vote. So make those choices quickly, and then we'll share the results with everyone. Yes, these are hard to answer. I see some people talking about. So thank you for being thoughtful about your answers. Okay, we're going to close it down in about 5 seconds. All right, let's shut this down. And if we could show the results, Jonathan, who's working in the background, that would be great. Awesome. So this is what you said. The vast majority of you, it looks like, are really concerned about being adaptive and responsive to the changing circumstances, which is fascinating because we're going to talk a lot about that. But there also seems to be a lot of concern about equity, which is very valid, particularly at the moment that we're in right now. And then it's spread out with the other three sort of at the top. So Lisa and Esther, my first question to you is, as you see these results, what are your reactions to these results? Does this resonate with each of you? Lisa, you want to chime in?
Sure. I mean, I appreciate even the chat, which said, why isn't there an all of the above? I mean, I think that it's hard. It's hard because people are battling many different, big, uncertain strategic questions coming to them at the same time. And I think, the question of how do we adapt is the right one, because one of my strong points of view is that leaders in particular are being asked to be experts and masters at skills they've never even had time to practice. I mean, I'd be curious if you had another poll that said how many people here have taken a master's class or any class on navigating ambiguity, on dealing with adaptive leadership, on toggling between big picture priorities and micro moments. So we have this just incredible pressure right now on leaders to be making important strategic choices urgently when there's a lot of information that's not known, and they haven't really had the practice to develop skills and processes around making those kinds of decisions in the middle of high moments of uncertainty.
Esther, what's your take on the poll here?
Well, I'm not surprised. I think I would have voted the same way. I'm thinking the number one thing facing teachers today is how to adapt. And there is no pattern for them to follow. They've had a really hard time because in the past, technology was supplementary. It was not the main part of the class. The main part of the class was really the teacher instructing. And so I think one of the problems today is that teachers have not adapted very well. And I don't want to blame them because, I mean, God, nobody knows the right answer. But they have taken what they were doing in class to what they're doing online. So there's a lot of lecturing online. And that lecturing is not effective. It wasn't effective in class, and it's not effective now. And so I think it's really important to be responsive. And I think that's part of the question is like, what can we do to be more responsive? And so as a teacher, what I do is I see sitting in front of me, whether they're on a Zoom call or whether they're in front of me, all these students. And being responsive means asking them how they would like to function in this environment. And so that's what I've done. In fact, my classes probably would be considered really odd because what I did is ask the kids, and it turns out they wanted to be in charge of the Zoom call. So they were, and that was great. It was great for me because then I was just a participant and a coach, which is basically my role in the classroom anyway. I think more teachers might want to ask those people that they're serving, the students, about ways that they think would be more effective to teach. And that's my suggestion.
Yeah, I love it. We're going to probably come back to that theme of being very student-centered and student-led and student-focused over and over again, but I think that's a great perspective. So let's jump in. Based on that, let's jump into a couple of other areas here. First, I wanted to kick it off with you, Esther, to kind of build off what you just said, because in your latest book, How to Raise Successful People, which everybody should go out and get. It's great. It tells us your personal story of your daughters, but also of raising your daughters, but also the story of your journey as an educator. But in that, you talk about being a huge advocate for student-driven learning and advocating this philosophy that you've called TRIC: trust, respect, independence, collaboration, and kindness. And so I'd love to know, continuing on what you just said, how would you grade schools on using TRIC during these last 3 months?
Very good question, as usual, Chris. Thank you very much. I am sorry to say that I would not give schools a very high grade. And I think it's because they've been overly concerned about making sure that students are still memorizing those irrelevant facts to pass those irrelevant tests that nobody wants and nobody sees the relevance of. Sorry. But so I don't think schools have done the right thing. And I've been talking about this quite a bit. I've been giving multiple webinars and so forth, but this one is actually the best because I'm with people that I can really communicate with, and I'm really excited to be part of this webinar. So can we, as teachers and administrators, can we go back and collaborate with those students that we're all teaching to see how they think we should most effectively lead the way? And I think if they would do that, I mean, first of all, the kids would be totally shocked. They're like, what? They're asking my opinion? Oh my God, that's so exciting. And then if we could follow some of those suggestions, I think it would make a huge difference to the way they're educated and to how excited they are about learning and to their passion. And just to give you an example, the fact that all the control for the class was put in the hands of the students, they decided independently, without any input from me or my co-teacher, none of us said anything, to publish another issue of the paper on time, May 29th, a 24-page full-size newspaper in hard copy that was then delivered to the school and mailed to all the parents. And they collaborated from home on their computers.
Wow.
I mean, would I have ever suggested this? Never. And so I have to give a shout out to them and to the other, actually some of the magazines also did the same thing, not to be outdone by the newspaper, of course. And this is the way I think it should work. And they learned so many skills by doing that. Can you imagine what you learn?
I mean, I think what you're hitting on is the engagement is so high when you hand over the learning to them and you give them that trust to do that, and they just took it and ran with it. Lisa, do you have any thoughts on Trick and sort of what you're seeing at the moment in time?
Absolutely. Well, first I want to build on that. And what I love about what Esther's sharing is that it is built on 38 years of doing this work. This is not new. This is a work that Esther's been doing, which is to be empowering students to be self-motivated learners and doers and contributors to their communities. And I loved even that example of that they came together to produce something on their own, because I think it's the embodiment of all those values. You have to trust your students that they are going to be working towards something. Notice that's very different than saying, I trust you guys, but make sure you don't cheat, and that the respect that she embodies in them to say, I'm honoring your work. I can't wait to see what you come up with, versus it has to be 500 words and it has to be this. And so I think what Esther has done is really flipped not just the model of how work is done, but really the model of what she values and what she cares about. She's not assessing based on known answers and results. And I think that is the enormous opportunity right now is to flip this and say, what do I really care about? What do I want to see in my students? If I'm successful and I've done my job empowering my students at the end of the year, is it that they've memorized this or that they've hit all the checklists and I've shoved it down this pipe called Zoom? Or is it that they feel like they can be agents of change? They feel like they can ask bold questions that they didn't have known answers to, and they have the skills to be resourceful, to find out between what's available to them, either through technology or through their relationships. They have the ability to give form to that idea and then to check if that idea is actually valuable or not. And they can shift to a deadline. And at the end of the day, I think what we want to do is to orient education and learning to helping students become self-actualized and to believe that they have the confidence in themselves to be lifelong learners. And I think that is the enormous opportunity of this moment. It's so disruptive. It's hitting all of us, and we have choices that we can make. And so it starts with the mindset about, well, what am I going to choose to do? And I think Esther is just this wonderful living example that you can make a different choice. She made a choice. I believe in you. I believe in your skills. I'm going to get out of the way. I'm not going to let you drown. It doesn't mean that her students didn't know that Esther didn't have high expectations for her, but they were expectations that they've embodied versus to perform to an outside imposed standard.
Another area that I think is tangential to the work that Esther's doing in Trick is the work that you're doing around design thinking. You've actually been a very thoughtful an important leader in helping us think about how design thinking can be used in schools, because you've seen it work so well in businesses and other organizations. So I'm wondering, how you think those strategies can help us tackle the current challenges in education.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Chris. I mean, I am passionate about design. I have been my whole career. For 20 years, thinking about design as a leadership skill that allows us to make choices that empowers others to be successful. We somehow continue to think of design and be curious to take a different poll of, the familiarity that folks have here with design. It's still seen as an artistic endeavor. Oh, I'm not a designer. I don't know how to color things and draw horses. Versus design is really a discipline about creating values for others. And I'll just share a quick definition, and then we can go into how this is playing out. My favorite definition of design and what it means to be a designer comes from a dear colleague of mine who started the MBA in Design Strategy program out of the California College of Arts, which is where I taught for about 8 years. And he said, my job as a designer is to make choices that trigger the right responses. So if we look at these beautiful devices, for example, that we would say are well designed, Apple put on we're a design driven company. What does that mean? That means that they hold themselves to a discipline of making choices in their product design and service design that enables their customers to find not only utility in using the products, but sheer delight and joy, which is why people sleep out for them and pay, 5 times as much money, because it's that incredible excitement you have because of all the surprise and the delight because the designers have made choices to trigger that response. Okay, so that means if everyone's listening here, if you make a decision that affects other people, newsflash, you're a designer. So your job is to learn what they need from you. So again, do they need compliance from you, or do they need creativity, imagination, experimentation, room to fail, room to be themselves? Those are design choices you can make in order to create the conditions for students to do their best work. And I just feel like at this point, we have so much data, not just from learning science, but even from neuroscience, that says we can make different choices that allow students to feel like they are safe, they can take a risk, that they are able to bring their full selves forward, but they have to be intentional choices that we make. And this moment that we're in, again, makes it hard in some ways, or gives us the opportunity to reframe, to say, what do they really need? And I'll just say one more thing about this moment, Chris, related to design. I mean, we at the D School, and particularly the K-12 lab, are working really hard to meet the needs that have just, seemed to pop up overnight. So for example, we have a whole initiative called supporting overnight educators, not just the teachers, but the parents too. How are they supporting their kids? Another critical component of design is getting proximate with the people that you're designing for, to be able to see them and work with them. How do you do that when you can't read their emotion, when you can't understand where they are, when they may or may not have connectivity that allows you to even put eyeballs on them? So we're experimenting with all kinds of ways to try to understand the student experience so that we can enable teachers and parents to still have that same empathy in making choices. And that's literally anything from like using TikTok, not as the experience, but as a window into the student world, to really understanding how we can better understand what the day in, day out is of their new experience.
That's awesome. I think the comment that design is the center of everything we do, and that includes teaching and learning, I think is really resonating. In fact, some people put some comments in the chat already about that we'll definitely want to come back to. And just as a reminder, I've seen a couple people already put questions in the Q&A. We will be reading off your questions for Lisa and Esther in just a few minutes, probably in about 10 minutes or so. So keep putting them in there. We won't rattle them off just yet. But we do appreciate you putting them there, and you can upvote other people's questions as well, so that if the most prescient ones kind of rise to the top. I want to switch gears just a little bit, because we've been talking so far about the challenges of this moment in time. And I think one of the most important things we have to do is start to imagine what happens after this moment in time is over. And so what I'd like to do is pose kind of a future scenario to you, and have you guys react to this very briefly to a couple of different areas. So here's the scenario. Let's imagine it's 2025 and we are past this crisis, long past it, and that there's a COVID-19 vaccine, life is back to normal, whatever that means. So let's talk about what this future looks like in three areas. And let's start with the one you've already been talking a little bit about, teaching and learning. And by that we could mean the delivery model, whether it's in person or virtual, or pedagogy, curriculum, putting students at the center, assessment, all of that. But teaching and learning, 5 years from now, past this crisis, what does it look like? Does it look different at all, Esther?
Well, I'm an optimist. And so I think that it's going to look different. And I'm hoping it will be very different in terms of, first, the delivery model. I hope that teachers will understand that lecturing might have worked really well in the 1800s. It might have worked really well before we had a computer world, but it doesn't work very well now. And so I think that they will have realized that, and so they will have modified. I think that in terms of assessment, I think assessment drives the system. And that's what we're all doing. The teachers are teaching to the test, and the parents are all worried about their kids are not going to have the right score on the test. And there's more and more worry about assessment. And then, the summer slump. The summer slump is forgetting all the useful facts that you were supposed to have memorized and didn't memorize in the first place. So the question is, how are they going to make assessments different? This is my idea, and hopefully they'll be able to do it. It's more mastery as opposed to grade level assessment. Mastery Connect was already part of a company called Instructure. There's already Mastery Transcript Consortium out there. They've been sort of on the edge trying to fight their way into this whole testing thing. Maybe and hopefully in 2025, there will be a different way to assess the students that will be much more related to the real world. And the curriculum will also be more relevant to the real world. We talk about like why kids learn things. They learn it when they see why it's relevant, and they don't learn it when they don't see any relationship to the real world. When they do learn it, it's not called learning, it's called memorizing. They memorize things that they don't think are relevant to the real world. They learn things that they know are relevant to the real world that they may want to use again. So I'm hoping it's going to be really different. And also, I think class sizes, now this might be I might be stepping into a sort of a minefield here, but I think that class sizes at the high school level can actually be bigger. And the reason they can be bigger is because when kids work together and they're motivated to work on projects that they care about, they can be in larger groups and work in groups. The teacher doesn't have to micromanage to the same degree, so therefore they can be bigger. I hope that happens as well.
I love that message, and it's certainly not what you hear every day, but certainly something for us to continue to talk about. Lisa, what do you think briefly about 5 years from now with teaching and learning? What's the world going to look like?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna borrow on Esther's optimism here. Again, I think there's a tremendous opportunity, and I think it's going to be really hard to get there. I don't know what the normal is. I don't think that we should even put that into the question about return to normal. I think we just have an opportunity to reframe what's needed. Because even if, we do find a vaccine and the COVID crisis, at least this acute moment, is done, we have some bigger changes that are not going to go away. I mean, certainly the prevalence of emerging technology, not just in the classroom, but the impact on the world, should be asking all teachers to fundamentally say, how do I make sure that if technology is going to impact every aspect of our life, that the technology reflects the students that I'm working with? How do I get them comfortable to participate? And we're doing a lot of work at the D School to break down some of the core concepts, for example, of AI into ways that enable all of our students to be better problem solvers, by just breaking it down to make sure that they understand, what are the foundations of AI, which drive so many of the other technologies that are growing in importance. And how do we ensure that they're thinking about that through a systemic lens, through an ethics lens, through the lens of privacy and data? And so we run workshops, for example, with middle schoolers. And when you hear an 11-year-old girl talking about, the potential to use regression analysis, in order to help support climate change, probably is the same kind of goosebumps that Esther gets when her students produce a newspaper. So I think it's about, taking a look at what are the foundational ways of thinking and learning that we need to be supportive in this moment, and to really release ourselves from that old mindset we have that it has to happen in a classroom, preferably a small classroom, to Esther's point, with desks and chairs. And now I'm not in any way saying that in-person learning isn't critical. When at the D School, all of our classes are experiential. Everything is on wheels. We do a lot of things with vertical spaces because that promotes collaboration. We do a lot of stuff around visualization and transmedia and different kinds of ways of communicating. So I think, again, we have an opportunity to really reimagine how do we create the kind of learning experiences in order to support the kinds of learners we want to put out in the world. Because I believe you can't, as I said earlier when we were talking about this adaptive moment, we can't expect people to become masters at things they aren't given time to practice. So what are the scaffold that helps them do that? And I guess just a couple quick thoughts, because I've been thinking about this a lot. I have also great empathy for teachers. I have such empathy for teachers and school leaders right now. This was not what they signed up for. They're exhausted. They're being told, for example, the go-to thing to think about, at least in the short term, is, okay, what's your plan for in-person? What's your plan for virtual? And what's your hybrid plan? So basically their workload for the summer, where they were hoping to regroup, has been tripled. Okay, and they don't even really know what they're teaching towards. They're teaching towards an old, outdated model that frankly can be automated, all that memorization stuff. So I would love it if administrators gave their teachers room to say, what are the one or two things you really want your students to be diving into? How can we take stuff off of your plate? How could we encourage you to work with others that know the technology, so you don't have to understand your pedagogy and the technology, but in fact, you can benefit? We got to open up space in order to reimagine that. And one just quick thing I'll say, and I just want to pull on the assessment part for Esther. I will say I wear many hats. So I teach at the D School. I work a lot with executives in K-12. I'm also a parent. And so I'm in it as well, and watching teenage daughters go through this process. And I cannot believe the holding on, for example, to the SATs and the standardized tests and finding all kinds of ways that continue to fail the students first and foremost, because they're trying to, like, again, shove it in a pipe of doing either APs at home or, not preparing to have their site being robust. And you could see that the stress and the anxiety around something that is broken in its intent to begin with really provides an opportunity to look at in a much more disruptive way. To say, at the end of the day, would we rather our kids crush the SATs or standardized tests, or would we rather our kids lean into character building, lean into social emotional wellness, lean into being a courageous, bold learner who's comfortable with the unknown versus good at gamifying the known? So I think that's the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, you're making a strong argument, I think, both of you, for depth over breadth, right? And focusing all of our attention on a couple of key areas at a time when we have a lot of stresses on the system and on ourselves, et cetera, that this focus can really help. And hopefully that focus is focused on deeper learning. So thank you. Okay. That was a lot. I figured that would be a big one because it's about teaching and learning, which you guys know best. But let's stay in the future for just a couple more seconds here, and we'll have our answers be a little briefer. How is this going to impact school governance? Meaning how state structures, policies, schools are funded, seat time, charter schools, school board management, et cetera, et cetera. Are institutions going to change in the next 5 years? Or are they so slow moving that we can't really expect much from them to be different? Esther?
So thank you for this question. As you know, I am very concerned with seat time, or what is called instructional minutes, in the state of California. And this is part of the Ed Code. Ed Code requires, for an instructional minute to be valid, the teacher has to see the student with your eyes all the time. And that's called an instructional minute. So anything where the student, it might be in another room or doing blended learning or working on their own independently, is not called instructional minutes. And it's not called seat time. It's called out of compliance. And so what I am working on, and what I hope the state of California is going to make these changes, some of the other states have already done that, by the way, is to redefine instructional minutes in the 21st century style. Students can be working independently without necessarily being in the direct line of eyesight for the teacher, and working on projects that matter. They can have like workspaces in schools where kids go and work on their projects and work independently. They don't need to be micromanaged. I mean, these 14-year-old kids, a lot of people are hiring them to be babysitters, right? And they go away and leave their kids with the 14-year-old. They can definitely go to another part of campus and work in a workspace without being under the direct supervision of a teacher, as long as they have a project in mind and as long as they're working with a peer. That is basically what I'd like to see. And I'd like to see more administrators asking teachers for their opinion. What do you think about the most effective methods? And then if school boards could also be more responsive to the educators. Some of those parents out there, of course they're very concerned, of course they're very interested. If they can put pressure on the school boards to basically listen to the kids, listen to the teachers, and not just come up with regulations that sound like that control. Because teachers need to be treated the same way that I suggest students be treated. They need to be given trust and respect, a lot of independence. They're allowed to collaborate and treated with kindness. All aspects of the school system need the same, from the school board to the superintendent to the principals. And right now there's like an adversarial relationship between administrators and teachers. It's like, I told you to do this. And, teachers are professionals. And also there's somewhat of has been a sort of adversarial relationship between parents and teachers. Parents like blaming teachers for things that they shouldn't have been blamed for. I saw one thing that I thought really made me smile during this whole pandemic, and that was a tweet that said, and it had tons of likes, that said, "I now realize teachers are not the problem." You know, it's all these parents at home. They now realize what it's like to have like 150 kids a day, and you're doing your best to educate them and make them be the best they can be. So we all need to work together, and hopefully this crisis will have cemented the fact that parents and teachers, we're together. We're working together to make that child the best that that child can be.
Lisa, any thoughts on how our institutions might change in the next 5 years?
Well, I love all those sentiments, Esther, and I would say I'm not an expert on governance of schools, but I will say that cultural change is critical, and it's one of the hardest things to do, particularly when you're trying to move a system. And you know, and that I think comes from both the leadership at the top around really setting intention about what it is that you want to be about, and what are the values that you care about, and how do those cascade, and then how do you allow the autonomy of, you know, the various stakeholders within the system to bring them about, and to have a mindset of enabling versus constraint. I mean, what I hear more than anything when I have tried to bring new things into K-12 and even teachers, even well-intentioned, is, yeah, but that would never work here. Yeah, but I don't have enough time. Yeah, but that's not allowed. Yeah, but, and it's really, you know, the teachers say, but what if I did? What if I did? What if that could look like? And so I'll just give you a quick example on one thing that we do. I teach a class at Stanford called Inventing the Future, where we actually teach creativity and futures practices to students to try to imagine the utopia and dystopia 50 years out, actually, not even 5 years out. And one of the most powerful things we do comes from my colleague, Tina Seelig, who I teach with, where she lists all of the assumptions that we have about any given topic. And, you know, what do we have about classroom instruction? What do we have, or about assessments, or what school boards should be and what the response is? And you just list it without bite, you just list it. And then we do the opposite. And then we say, okay, well, which one of these is preferable? And that just opens up, like, well, how might we? I see, for example, someone had mentioned in the chat, like, why don't we have students attend board meetings? Why don't we? Why don't we? Why don't we reimagine what we actually care about, you know, in the report card?
And why
Some
aren't
of these
students on school boards? Why aren't
yeah,
they on school
I
boards?
mean, right? It's like, listen, if a student just won the Nobel Peace Prize, right? I mean, like, so again, this gets back to respect and honoring, like, who knows authority. So if you have a culture that says, wow, good ideas can come from anywhere. Wow, we honor human contribution, even if one is younger than the other. And so I just think it's an enormous opportunity right now to really, you know, open these old models wide open and see. And then the last thing I'll say on this, which is kind of related to the assessment, but also how institutions are organized and often how funding gets done, is that I think there is an opportunity to really say, what are the things that we want to, within the system, amplify? And so, for example, if we could take a look, so many students have done amazingly creative, community-oriented things, you know, in response, whether they're shopping for neighbors, or they're checking on neighbors, or they're supporting healthcare workers, or even now, right, they're engaging in civics and in social justice in ways that we haven't seen before. And thank goodness that we're opening up different kinds of conversations. Like, where's the report card on courageous conversations? Where's the report card on asking brave questions, or on making new relationships, or on, you know, bringing something to life that didn't exist? Like, why can't we find a way to articulate the value of those things so that we can do more of it?
Awesome. So I'm going to pull us back to the moment. We were talking about the future and all the possibilities, and I love the optimism. I share all of that optimism, which is great, and creative ideas. Let's focus on one last thing before we turn it over to Q&A from the audience. And I appreciate everybody who's putting stuff in the chat. But if you have a question specifically for Lisa and Esther, please put it in Q&A. But here's my question, because we're talking about institutions, and we know that no matter how much we want our institutions to change, a lot of that change is going to be guided by finance, by money, and by funding. And we are heading into a time when we know, especially in states like California, but a lot of other states as well, that funding is going to be hard to come by, and people are already preparing for large cuts. So what I'd like to do is, since you guys are self-admittedly not the finance experts, I'd actually like to bring in former Superintendent Max McGee as a sort of a special guest to kind of comment on this a little bit. Max, you there? Hey, there you are.
Hey, great. Can you hear me all right?
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So Max, you're a former superintendent of Palo Alto, but you also work with a number of superintendents throughout the country. And you obviously have had the deep responsibility of creating a large organization that had to be fiscally solvent and be sensitive to all the needs that you had to for teachers and students and families and so on. We're going into a tough time. What sort of things do you think that we have to be aware of, and what are the things we have to be focused on with regard to finance in schools?
Sure. And yeah, I was state superintendent as well, and we had some really big, in Illinois, big issues. So I think we need to focus on who works with our children, and that's the teachers. And so it's critically important to create a culture of trust with the teachers. Esther and I co-presented Trust is a Must at S by SW a couple of years ago, and had a great audience. And so when you have that culture of trust, you find that, and actually there's a statistic about this, a 10% increase in trust is worth a 30% increase in salary. And so as you empower, as you trust teachers, as you give them autonomy to teach in depth, your conversation earlier about depth versus breadth, I was going, yep, will help that. And we'll find that I think teachers, when they're given the autonomy, when they're given control over, frankly, their own budgets, salary becomes less of an issue. It's still important. I also think that so many districts, whether it's Palo Alto with 12,000 or little districts here in Illinois with 2,000 or some of our big cities, there is so much administrative overhead. And it really, you ought to have principals teaching some classes. You ought to have superintendents running a seminar series. And frankly, with a teacher shortage, that is what's going to drive an enormous amount of change, because there's just not going to be enough teachers, and you're going to have to start teaching teachers with respect, with kindness. This sounds familiar, Esther. Yes. And you're going to have to design a system based, as Lisa said, first on empathy and understanding. And so if we focus the funding on supporting our teachers, we will have a better, more productive system. We'll have students that, frankly, will learn more deeply and better. And we will have, I think, administrators, as they are given and required to do some teaching, really understand that this is not an easy job, and create a culture where, frankly, you can do a lot more in depth with the same amount of money in many districts.
Well, I know all the teachers listening out there would love hearing this, right? To support the teachers and put them at the forefront. And yet we all know in tough times economically, they're the first ones that get hit, because it's the major cost, right, of any school system. And we also know that not only will COVID-19 crisis impact finances, but places like California, with retirement system being a big financial burden, that school districts are getting hit pretty hard. Do you have any advice to superintendents and school boards out there about how they can start to balance these needs if they really do want to put their teachers first? And yes, maybe they can cut some administrative costs. Is there any other way to tackle this in years when many school districts might be in contract negotiations, and that can be really tough on an entire system?
So I think the answer, Chris, is to look long-term and really think you want your teachers to say, so how are we going to take care of them 3 and 4 years from now? And I had my debate with my own school board on this, who were insistent on 1-year contracts, 1 year at a time. That just doesn't work. And again, that shows that you're really not trusting the teachers. And I think as teachers and unions work together, when I worked with a union in Illinois, we had 5-year contracts. And so you would have labor peace and trust over the period of 5 years. So they really need to look at a 5-year horizon. And so maybe this year, whether it's a minimal increase or just a bonus add-on, what can you do? What can you save this year that you can then save and spend next year? So I really think in education, we are hampered by this year-to-year mindset, and that literally has to change. And one of the things that I learned as state superintendent, I was able to work with the legislature in Illinois to develop a 3-year funding plan for early childhood education that really changed what we did in Illinois, and frankly contributed to equity and closing the achievement gap maybe more than any other initiative, because it was sustained over an amount of time. And we saw these kids, as they moved from early childhood up through 3rd grade, the scores improve across the board. In fact, I ran into a state senator not too long ago who just had a 2-year-old, and he says, I'm putting her in early childhood as soon as I can, because I still remember those conversations, a decade ago. So yeah, it's taking the long view is critically important.
I think that's just tremendous advice, especially in a crisis like this. We get so wrapped up in what do I need to do now to survive and get through today, and it's very hard for us to take that long view. And so I think that's fantastic advice. So here's what I'd like to do. We only have about 15 minutes left, and there's now a mounting number of questions in Q&A. Thank you to everybody who's putting stuff in there. So I'm gonna start to share some of those questions from the audience with everybody, knowing that, Lisa, we might lose you in a few minutes, I know, because you have to go off to an important family event with your daughter getting an award today. Hopefully she's not listening and there's no spoilers there. But let's jump in, and I think there are some really important questions here, and it's very relevant to the moment in time that we have, and it's a question of equity. And all of us have benefited from the privileges that we've had, and we've been very fortunate to work with in communities that in many cases are also very privileged. How do we take some of these things that we're talking about and really say that these are things that can or should or could be done with all students in mind, and taking into effect all the different needs that are out there? So what does equity look like in this crisis? Lisa, do you want to tackle this at all, since I know you're going to leave?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. And I'm so glad that someone brought it up, and it needs to be a part of this conversation. And I so just want to build on Max's perspective on the long view. I mean, this equity question feels very urgent in the moment. And in some ways, I get uncomfortable when saying this moment that we're in. We've been in this moment for a long time. And I think that this crisis just puts a spotlight on just how limited many of us have seen a wider crisis. I mean, it's now wide open. And so that presents an opportunity. And I think there are some short-term things that we need to address immediately around trying to address homelessness, people that don't have access to the same kind of food stability, which, there's big macroeconomic pressures on right now. And we need to sort of, first of all, see schools as the heart of communities and what that does for communities, and have the communities come together. And we need to really, take that seriously as a strategic question that we need to focus on in the short term, and to be creative on how we're going to support that. So, really thinking expansively about partners and other ways of addressing that. And I think longer term, we have an opportunity to look at our curriculum, to look at the role and responsibility of schools to bring in some different ways of talking about inequity, of talking about privilege, of making sure that this isn't just a blip that goes away, that we do some deep, hard thinking about what does it mean to actually have an inclusive, equitable country that I think starts with our schools. So I think it is a both and in terms of looking at the immediate opportunities to make some choices that will serve the pain and support grief. And at the same time, I think that we have to take a longer view about what is it going to take to look at the underlying dynamics involved and how we can address that.
Esther or Max, do you have any thoughts on this?
And with that, I'm going to say thank you so much. It has truly been a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for showing up. And we have a lot of work to do. And I'm glad we're having these conversations to help seed collective possibility.
Yes.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Esther or Max, do you have any thoughts on the question of equity, especially around COVID-19?
I think we're going to have to do more about moving out into the community. We still have this mindset that school is a place where people come. And, with the what I call the emergency remote teaching, we've been trying to push out blended learning. But I think as we think about redesigning school in the long view, we need to think how we can deliver more services to kids and to parents literally in the community where they live. And in smaller groups and smaller numbers, whether it's after school hours, Saturday, or split school hours. We're wrestling with this with my wife's Center for Urban Education here in the Chicago area. How do you push with a summer program? You got to push out and be in the community rather than bringing kids onto the college campus. And we're going to do it. We're working with local businesses to set up drop-in learning centers, for example, that have technology. The McDonald's in North Lawndale, the the Starbucks on the South Side, the Walgreens, the CVS, places where people can at least come and there's a place to sit. And I think that's what we're going to really need to think about is redesigning this educational experience.
I mean, I think what you're getting at there is really important. You're talking about that schools don't have to solve this by themselves,
Right.
that there are a lot of resources in our communities that can help us do things like get internet access to people in the community where the school isn't providing that, but the larger community is for the good of the community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm very practical as a teacher, as usual. And so one of the main things that I'm worried about in terms of equity is making sure that every student has a device,
Mm-hmm.
every single one, and not one per family. It's like one per kid. And that Wi-Fi data is part of the government responsibility. Every state should provide Wi-Fi for all families. Okay, so families that can afford to pay a lot should pay a lot. Families that are low income, they should be able to get it for free. And I think that's one of the number one things for equity. And so today, there's like more than 30% of the students are not even online. They're not even logging into their Zoom calls. And why is that? Well, most of those kids that are not logging in, they don't have access to Wi-Fi and they don't have a device. So I would say, let's start with where it's at right now. Let's make sure they all have it. And, you know, one thing, those Chromebooks, they're not that expensive. You know, a couple of years ago, I actually bought 100 Chromebooks online at one of those big sales on Amazon for $99 a Chromebook. It was a real deal. I was very excited. And so I think that's one of the things the first thing that we should do. And I guess the other thing is what Max was talking about earlier. And that is, you know, we need to have preschool education available and free for all kids, because a lot of these kids come to school and at 5 years old and they have no skills and there's no way for them to catch up. And the ages 0 to 5 are the number one most intensive learning years, that your brain develops capacity by age 5. So why are we wasting those years? We as a government could invest in those preschoolers, and that would produce people in their 20s that are really educated and resilient and have social emotional skills, because that's what they teach in preschool. So those are the three main things:
I'm glad
data,
that both of
computers, and preschool.
I'm glad you both of you mentioned that, because you know all the research bears out that early education, the amount of money we can put into early education always comes back in with a huge return on investment. It's where a lot of our efforts really need to go, and it's a great way to tackle equity from the very beginning, rather than waiting to address issues later on. I want to get to a question here from our friend Mark Prensky. Many of you know Mark Prensky from his books that he's written and the research he's done in education around digital technology. Mark asked a question here specifically about change in behavior, and keying in particularly, Esther, on many of the things that you're talking about are hard for teachers to change to. And so what do you think, both of you, what do you think that schools and school districts need to do differently to really enable that change to happen when we know it's so difficult?
It is really difficult, but I think, so the question a lot of people ask is like, why are the students in the journalism program, there's 700 of them, by the way, why do they seem so empowered and independent and passionate and, you know, happy? And the answer really is because it's the culture of that program, and the culture of the school has to change from one that, you know, where one group is in charge of another group to a collaborative effort. There's a sense of community that we're all working on this together. Administrators, superintendents, you know, school boards, everybody. But right now, as I said in an earlier comment, it's not that way. It's somewhat adversarial. And you know, when an administrator comes in to evaluate a teacher, they usually send an email 2 weeks before. And I'm telling you, those teachers, for 2 weeks, they can't sleep at night. You know, they're like frantic. It's like, aren't we all in this together? If you're not doing it the right way, can't we all help each other? And so that's what we need to develop, a change in the culture of school, so that it's a place where we all collaborate to make sure that that child is supported. And that's what so I've had experience doing it with hundreds of kids. We can do it with thousands. It just depends on the leader of the school or the district.
Yeah, and Esther can corroborate this, but I've done this I wish Lisa were still here, because we use the Stanford D-School shadow protocol, shadow a student protocol. But I had every single administrator shadow a student for a day. And it did more to change the culture, because we changed then how we observe and evaluate teachers. We changed how we dealt with our historically underrepresented population. We changed physical environments. We changed, for example, one school, the passing period to 10 minutes, because the kids didn't even have time to use the bathroom or the teachers or to talk to one another. I've since am now teaching other schools how to do that. And every time we bring the board, we bring the administrators, you have to follow a student for a full day. That includes the bus ride. That includes changing into gym clothes. That includes eating the school lunch. Great things change. And really, trust almost develops overnight, because finally somebody empathizes with kids and with the teachers. And we had the complete union support of this. And these are ways that you really do bring about meaningful change. And because once you have that respect and trust, then you can really start moving the system in the right direction.
And if you haven't seen it yet, there's an official Shadow a Student program out there that people can check out online. And there's a fabulous video that they did on the PBS NewsHour, where they actually filmed a administrator it might have been in Illinois, actually, Max, following, she was an assistant principal following a student around for a day. And it's very, very telling about what she learned. But I would say, to push back a little bit, at the end, she's very honest about not being able to change much. And she's talking about change over years. Maybe we'll be able to adjust the student's schedule next year, et cetera. And it just doesn't feel responsive. And I think that sense of urgency is maybe the hardest thing to change. Would you guys agree?
Yes, I think that's one of the silver linings that we have here in this pandemic, is that the schools are forced to change. We've been talking about change for years and years and years. And now it's not like, do you want to change? It's like, how are you going to change? Mm-hmm. And it's because of this pandemic. So that is one of the good things. And if we can implement things that are going to put the student at the center, and for doing things like Max suggested, which are great, you know, following a student during a school day. Maybe we don't even need to follow them. Maybe they can just tell us what it's like and we can figure it out. So, because the school day now is totally different. Yeah. But changing human habits is very difficult. And there's a lot of books out there that say you have to do it in tiny steps. And so, you know, that's great to do it in tiny steps, but we don't have a tiny step right now. We've got a huge step, and we just have to take advantage of it. That's the only optimistic thing I see in this whole pandemic.
What I hear you saying, Esther, is we got to rip off the Band-Aid.
Yes, rip off the Band-Aid. That is right. Thank you, Chris.
So we're coming up near the end, but we're probably going to go over a few minutes. I do want to get one more question in because I think it's a great question. And I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all the great questions in the Q&A. If you want to stay on afterwards, we can probably go through some of these as well, but we want to be mindful of time. Yvonne Morales asked a great question about assessments. And he wants to know, you know, how do we match any new system of assessments with what's really needed in the job market, in society? And I think that's a really great question because we, as you said, Esther, assessments drive everything. But if they're driven from a place that doesn't match with the true needs, then they're off. Do you guys have thoughts on this?
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should let Max start.
Okay.
That's a tough question.
Because she and I have talked about this as well. We need to think, what is the job market? And the job market today is not the same it will be in 5 years or 10 years. What we have to do is, 2/3 of we're preparing kids for jobs that we don't even know about. And that's what our mindset needs to be. And is how we prepare kids for jobs that don't exist yet. So that means depth of thought, that means civil discourse, that means significant problem solving, that means communication skills. And I think we're seeing as colleges now are turning away from the SAT and AP out of necessity. You're going to see more of them looking for these and see examples of kids' portfolio work products that reflect these skills. So I know we're running low on time. I'll leave it at that and turn it back to Esther. But let's not think about what today's job market is. Again, the long view is the jobs in today's job market won't exist 10 years from now, many of them.
So here's my suggestion. So we can't predict the future. So we have to have all kids be resilient and all kids be self-learners. And that's the most important thing. Can you learn effectively on your own, using the internet, using community resources, using something? You don't want to have to be reliant on a teacher to tell you what to do. So you have to be a self-learner. You have to be self-confident. I did a talk at Berkeley in which I said, student as CEO of their learning. That's what they need to be, CEO of their learning. If I just look at my daughter, Susan, she's like the CEO of YouTube. When she graduated from college, they didn't even have an internet,
right?
So how could she even plan for a job like that? Because it wasn't even conceptualized. So what you need to do for all parents is think about, number one, can they innovate? Can they be creative? Can they be self-learners? And if they can do that, they're prepared for the future. That's my number one suggestion.
Well, I think, Max, you have something to add to that?
No, just a thumbs up.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have to end on that note because I think that's the optimism that we all share and that we have to continue with every single day to do the work that will transform lives for students. And so we are going to continue kind of a post webinar conversation with Max and Esther in a couple of minutes, but I want to say a couple of comments here before we lose too many of you. And I want to first thank everybody for joining us today. And it's been a great conversation with Esther and Lisa and Max. Thank you for being our surprise guest, which is great. And I wanted to let you know about a couple of other things coming up that Gratus Labs is involved with. We don't have a date yet for this, but there is another webinar, free webinar, that will be coming up shortly with Esther again. We just can't get enough of Esther, and Desmond Blackburn and Max. So this is a preview of that a little bit, but that whole conversation we focused entirely on equity. Even though we talked a little bit about it here, we just scratched the surface. And we're excited to have a whole hour focused just on that. So please stay tuned for more information on when that date and time is. But again, it's coming up, and we'll try and get the word out to everybody who participated today. In addition to that, if you would like any information on how to bring Esther or Max or Lisa or me into the conversation at your schools or districts or communities, we'd be happy to do that. Please reach out to Jonathan at My Gratus. He's working here in the background. Thank you, Jonathan. You can go to their website, gratuslabs.com, or you can reach out to any one of us as well. So that officially wraps up our webinar. We only went 5 minutes over, which is amazing. Usually we goes much longer. So I appreciate everybody's attention through the last hour. We thank you for your time. Again, we know you have a lot of options these days, and we really appreciate all of the comments and the questions that you had here with us today. And we're sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we have recorded this and we will share this online shortly for all of you. So we're going to officially close out the webinar, but Esther and Max have agreed to stay on for a few more minutes here. And if we can get to a couple more questions, we will. So are you cool with that, Esther and Max?
Yeah, I'm cool with that.
All good. All good.
Great. So there are some great questions here. And I think some of you have seen a lot of comments in the chat as well. which are very supportive of a lot of things that you all are saying and pushing the thinking as well. There was an interesting question here that was very different that I wanted to see your thoughts on. It was a question actually about higher ed. We've been focused mostly on K-12 in this conversation. And they asked, what do you think we need to focus on, especially with teaching and learning at the university level during this time of crisis?
Well, should I start?
Yeah.
Sure. So at the university level, so the universities are famous or maybe infamous for having large classes of direct instruction and very little interaction with their students. So for example, I went to Berkeley, and the first 2 years of my classes at Berkeley, there were classes of 800 people. And so you just went, listened, took notes, and then went home. And then I went back to Berkeley. I've been there many times. I'm not just criticizing Berkeley, but at the other universities do the same thing. It's still the same thing. As a matter of fact, I did a little research at Stanford, and I discovered that 81% of their seating at Stanford is fixed into lecture spaces in cement. So the question is, how are you going to change that? But I think that they have to be a little bit more innovative and understand that, just learning what is required for that class might not necessarily be the most important thing. How about what that class is teaching and how that relates to the real world today, and how that can somehow impact or detract, some way relate the content of the class, the curriculum, to the world today. Then I think it's more useful to kids, and then I think it would be more effective. I would also invite them to do more peer-to-peer learning. We all learn the most from talking to other people. That's why we all love the breaks at conferences, because we all race out and then want to talk to all the other people. And it's not because, and it's not because we miss them, but we probably do miss them a little. But it's because we want to talk to the other people and want to see what they thought. So that's where the learning takes place. So that's what I would do in universities. And then also I would cut back on all the testing.
I think they need to focus more on field experiences. I went to Dartmouth to be an engineer, but for a trimester, I worked with 12 kids from Harlem Harlem, New York in 1969, a 24/7 residential program. And it was a life-changing experience. I'm an educator rather than engineer, still paying off my Dartmouth tuition, however.
Oh my God.
So I think more field work, and frankly, I think we're going to see universities have more emphasis on having kids design their own major, as well they should. The idea of a major is just, I think, truly outmoded. And kids really, university kids really need to be given trust to develop their own major. So those are field experiences and design your own major. I think that's where we hope to see universities go.
That's great. There's a couple more I want to get to. One is a entirely different direction, which is about gaming. And I guess we could broadly probably interpret that they mean digital gaming, but there's lots of different types of gaming, but they probably mean computer games. Does that play a role in any of this? We used to talk a lot about gaming as a way to engage students in the learning process. And it's gone away a bit, and there's been a lot of criticism around gamification, obviously, in education. But do you guys have any thoughts on the role of gaming in learning?
I think it's critically important. And my grandson, who's now 15, learned to read by playing Madden football, because he had to read literally online. He had to learn how to read all the various tips to excel in Madden football. And a granddaughter learned to read on YouTube, and Esther will tell her daughters learn to read on Sesame Street. So, yeah, gaming is really important, and especially in problem solving and critical thinking. And I think COVID, what we've seen, even how they're looking at gaming now as a way to deliver content, is a way to deliver contents. Who was it? Travis Scott. I know my rappers from my 15-year-old grandson. Gave a concert on Fortnite. I mean, you can give lectures on game platforms now, not just lectures, but completely interactive experiences. You can talk about social justice issues. and game platforms. And I think so. I think it has I think we'll see a resurgence in gaming in education.
So I'd like to add to that. I agree with everything Max said. And I am actually working with a group of former students who are working on a company we're going to set up using gaming as a way to learn. And I think gaming is very important. A lot of people are addicted to games. If we can get them as addicted to games that are learning games, that would be the greatest thing of all. So I do think that we have probably not only ignored it, but in some cases even dismissed gaming as a way to educate. And that is, I don't think that that's a very smart idea, because you can learn a lot. Just like Max's grandson learned how to read, my God, that's such a great story. And we need more kids to do that. And actually that will help with equity as well, you know, because that's a way to learn to read and maybe to do math and, you know, be critical thinkers. So yes, great, gaming is a great idea.
You briefly mentioned equity there again, Esther, and I want to share a very important comment that came through in the Q&A that I think we'd be remiss to ignore, and I'm just going to read it out loud and have us react to it a little bit. But it was an anonymous comment that said, "I'm very worried that this conversation is being led by 4 white people who come from a place of privilege and don't understand what some school districts, families, and educators are facing." It's obviously a very, very valid comment, and it's one that we actually had a conversation about ahead of time, being very self-aware of that as well. And it's also, by the way, one of the reasons why specifically there is another webinar focused exactly on that issue. We knew that we couldn't do it justice here, but I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts. I have personal thoughts that I'm willing to share too, but Max, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great observation. I know I talked to Desmond Blackburn, and that'll be, I think, June 24th or June 30th, about leading with an equity lens. So please join us through that. But you know, my wife runs a Center for Urban Education here in out of a college and works. So we work with kids in North Lawndale, East Aurora, Illinois, and are well aware of these issues. And I think coming from a place of privilege, it is not just a responsibility; it is a moral imperative to put equity first and foremost. And that's more than equity and opportunity and access. It's equity and justice. It's equity and family support. And so, no, I think the comment's a great one, and which is why we wanted to do another series. But we do have. I don't want to dismiss the fact that our skin color is different. As I said, I went into this job to work because of my work with 12 young men of color in Harlem, New York in 1969, which is not even the Harlem, New York of today by a long shot. And the idea that we can support our historically underrepresented populations and have that a moral imperative to do so. And Esther and I did a lot of equity work with the East Palo Alto students when we were there. I mean, I had one of my great research students I personally mentored, ran music classes, Sky Chensky, 2 days a week there. And we just, we have to make those connections and connect what is serving all students and what's working best for think what is working best for some students needs to work best for all students. And that's our responsibility to ensure that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So the equity issue is a big issue. And one of the things that I think is where it starts is when the child is small. And that's why we need to have daycare early on for children. And if you look at countries that have free early daycare, they're the ones that are actually doing really well. A lot of those parents, you know, they can't take proper care of their kids because they're working 2 jobs or whatever. So in order to provide more equity, I think we need to first have the daycare, and secondly in schools. If kids can be given an opportunity early on to work collaboratively and to feel good about themselves, they can then take that and run with it. I know I accidentally, it wasn't on purpose, did a survey at Palo Alto High School on actually equity issues. And it was because I had a group of visitors that had come from Mexico, and they were talking to kids around the school. And what they discovered is that the black and brown kids, they weren't even applying for the more difficult classes. Mm-hmm. And the reason they weren't is their self-esteem was so low. I mean, and the question is, how did it get that low? And, you know, it shouldn't be like that. Those kids are just as smart as all the other kids. It's just how you feel about yourself. And that's one of the principles that I've always had in my programs, is trying to make sure that all kids feel self-confident so that they can achieve whatever it is that they're dreaming about. So anyway, in response to that, we talked to some of those kids and, tried to help them. But, just having a few sessions, 3 or 4 sessions, it's a drop in the bucket. It needs to happen every day.
Yeah. Well, these are clearly systemic issues that we all have to address in various ways. I'll tell you personally, I feel often very uncomfortable about entering into the conversation around equity because of the perception of who I am, which may or may not be mapped to the reality that people know about. But even going and saying, here are the things that I've done to address equity, somehow make me feel uncomfortable because it doesn't feel like I have a voice to be able to that should be heard as strongly as others who are in the community today. And so it's a very difficult question for everybody, I think. But I think the key piece that I've seen is listening and bringing as many voices together as possible to develop authentic solutions that everybody feels moves us in the right direction. And that's something that we all have to do, regardless of where we came from and our skin color and so on. So, sorry, I'm there we go.
At least you're not getting an emergency call.
No, I'm sorry. This is what happens when you go over your time here. You start to hear all of our personal messages kind of pop in.
When we shadowed students and we had focus groups with our historically underrepresented population in Palo Alto, because we had what we call the Minority Achievement and Talent Development Task Force. We heard so many stories from the kids that really changed policies. I mean, we ended up with, frankly, free summer school and summer, not just remedial, summer enrichment activities and opportunities for kids. We ended up, really changing how we taught 6th and 7th grade math, because that's the trajectory. And so we had, mathematics co-teachers. We learned that we needed family liaisons in the community to help parents understand how to do school. And so again, as Lisa Solomon would attest, that whole design process starts with empathy, understanding. And that's why, I said earlier, and this is the importance of working out in communities,
absolutely.
Yeah. So Max was really a great superintendent for Palo Alto. He made a lot of incredible improvements, and another one of them is the Advanced Academic Research Program that he brought to Palo Alto, which is just amazing, and the math programs. And so basically, as a teacher in that district, I would like to thank him personally for all the things that he did.
Awesome.
That was great.
Well, on that note, I guess I should also say some thank yous to both of you. Thank you for taking time out to share your thoughts and your expertise, not only today, but for all the work that you continue to do for students and families everywhere. And I want to thank everybody who joined us. We actually had a number of people, about 25 people, hang on here to the very end and go overtime with us. So you guys get the extra gold star here for hanging out with us and listening to us just chat on. But a number of people put very nice comments in the chat. If you get a chance to see them, Esther and Max, not only thanking you for your ideas, but also commenting about their own experiences and looking forward to future webinars like this. And there's even an invitation here to go down to Tecnológico de Monterrey, which some of you may know, it's a very important and famous school in Mexico. So maybe our next webinar is going to be in Mexico.
Yes,
There you go.
You never know. That would be exciting.
I would love it. So yeah, tell us more. We're there. So thank you guys again. We're going to officially stop recording this, and we will stop broadcasting. And thank you again for everybody for taking time out of your day to join the conversation. Be safe. Thank you for all the work that you do to make change happen every day. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
In a few weeks. Thanks,
Yes.
Esther.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.